So I want to talk about the data that we collect and how we go about collecting that data. So the very first thing that I would propose in any data collection process is that you create a team of multiple partners, not only institutional or professional or tribal leadership perhaps, but also grassroots folks and folks that are providing the service that you're talking about or dealing with the issue that you're researching. And so for me, I like to have as many members on that team representing as many different departments when I'm doing a comprehensive plan. So I put together a team of maybe 5 or 6 folks, at least. I want to caution you not to create a team of too many either. One of the problems in creating that team too large is just like having a large tribal council. Decision making and finalization processes can take a long time. So you want a team approach that can be focused on the effort at hand. The other thing is that I recommend the team approach because my experience is that when we work in tribal communities, we have a tendency to operate in silos, and those silos are not going to be ideal in a planning process. So let's talk about the options and how to build the survey or the data tool out, data collection tool. I've done surveys both qualitative and quantitative. And my experience is that I much prefer aggregating data that is quantitative than qualitative. There are methodologies by which you can aggregate data that's collected through a qualitative process. But when you're approaching a tribal community that may or may not be strong in that communication level for whatever reason, you tend to want to do quantitative. So I like to do quantitative because it gives them options, and I like to make the options solution-based. There's a tendency for leadership to be afraid of what tribal members may share or might put into a survey response. And I try to remove that fear by making sure that options are solution-based and that the options are coming from that team research. So they've gone out and they've researched with different service providers as to what options should, may there be, and then those are what we give as options. And then we give the other, and that other should help to capture any great ideas that folks might have that haven't been considered in the past. And so not only a list of options that is created by the service providers or the people involved in what kind of data is to be collected, but to give that option at the end that allows them to offer another option. So we want the process. Any survey data should be collected starting at the community level and then go up to the leadership level. If it starts at the leadership level, meaning if the leaders kind of dictate what the survey is about, so to speak, it tends to lessen the intrigue or the interest of the tribal members. So in my experiences, I make sure that leadership is involved in defining those things that need to be, those data that need to be collected. But I also know that the planning process, the survey process starts with the community. So it's community driven, but we have to make sure that there are communication pieces built into the process to make sure that the communication gets to the leadership and that the leadership takes that data. In my case, with community planning, I create a data set from the initial survey of the community. I run that data set by a focus group or 2 or 3 just to verify that the data collected reflects an overall sense of the community. I have yet to change anything, maybe a verbiage of summarizing, but I've yet to change any data that's been collected by the community. I did have a very interesting experience where a community was in an upheaval. They were removing a tribal chairperson, and the positive solution-based options did not include a per capita, and so a lot of angry responses came through in the process. It was a very challenging survey, because I didn't want to throw out those surveys, which is what the leadership wanted me to do, but I had to aggregate the data according to the responses. So it can be interesting, but it eventually needs to be communicated to the leadership. And in my case with community planning, I like to have the leadership prioritize. So what I do is the focus group, and then I share that information out of those focus groups with the staff, and I facilitate a planning process with the staff. I've done it a couple different ways, whether we break up into teams of multidisciplinary type teams, and those teams create projects, programs, or policies to meet the needs that have been identified in the survey. Or I've facilitated an entire staff to come up and create policies, programs, and services that are needed to fulfill the community's identified needs. So I've done both. You can do it a variety of ways, but what I do with that project, program, and policy list, or those service development lists, or is I take that list to tribal council, and then I allow tribal council to determine what the priorities are. My experience as a grant writer is that everything is a priority. And so it's hard sometimes to narrow down the priorities, so that I call it chasing the money, but we don't want to chase the money. We want to be successful in our proposals and program development. And so we focus. And that's what I encourage the leadership to do, is to not do, I call it, you can stand at the entry to a forest and you can shoot a shotgun and hope you hit something. Or you can become very focused with what you know is in your target, and you can hit your target better. And so planning and prioritization does that and allows for that. And ideally, any programs or policies or anything that comes before council for funding after this process is based upon whether it helps them meet their goals and their priorities. So the leadership prioritizes those programs, policies, and projects, and that's what guides their final plan. I also know that when I put the survey tool together, in my case, I go to as many department heads, and my team, I ask my team to do the same, from the health department to housing and everything in between. So service programs, TANF, the Temporary Assistance to Needy Family programs, the WIOA program. I go to the education department, the road department, the planning, if they have a planning department, what is the priorities of that planning department? If they have a TARO, the Tribal Employment Rights Office, if they have if they have an ordinance or they have an officer, then I go to them and I see what input they would like to have in the survey process. But it is so important to broaden your scope, because we want to avoid survey burnout. The other thing is that in the development of this tool, it's important to be trauma informed. So I've shared with you a little bit of the experiences I've had with trauma and tribal communities, but I think it's important that when we develop a survey tool or a research tool, that we make sure that it's trauma informed. And by that I mean we have to be careful of triggers, that we don't cause triggers in the community with our questions. We have to make sure that we're empowering people with options that are viable. Like if we say, what's going to curb domestic violence, and we say by putting everybody in counseling, is that viable? What is viable, and how do we make sure that we set folks up with hopeful options that are possible and realistic? The other thing that's important about being trauma informed is what I get to in the next slide. So when it comes time for implementing the tool, there are some really serious issues to confront first, and that is even getting in the door to collect your research data. How do you get in the door? I love this this graphic because that's how you feel. It's like pulling teeth sometimes to get folks to answer your questions. And so, number one, we have to make sure that any question or data piece, data tool we've created does not have a survey bias. So that's like if I were to sit down with just my relatives to develop this tool, and I didn't consider people in other clans or other societies or other districts, but I sat down with just my relatives to create this tool, how much bias might there be? So it's really important that the questions are well-rounded from various entities, and that the options are also ideas and options from different entities. The second thing is the surveyor bias. So I've created this great tool, and I'm ready to put it out into the community, and I ask my friends and my relatives to help me distribute it. But everybody that distributes it to my friends and my relatives. Am I getting a true picture of the full community? Because remember, in Eagle's View planning, I talked about getting a picture of the entire community. Not just my tio Shpai, not just my aunties, not just my cousins, not just my grandbabies, but the entire nation. And so we have to make sure that we are careful about training surveyors to collect information. If that's how we choose to roll out our survey, how do we collect the information without having any influence on the answers? That's a training process for anybody that's going to deliver that survey. I love training young people to go and collect surveys. There's a summer youth program in many of our tribal communities, and folks never know what to do with their summer youth employees. How better to empower our young people by involving them in a process to collect data? So I like training, I call them my planning ambassadors. I like training them first in historical trauma so they understand why people might come at them sideways and might respond to them angrily or whatever. So I train them in historical trauma, and then I train them in how to deliver a survey without inserting any bias. I also am very careful that I train ambassadors to not use the survey discussion, if you will, for gossip. What they gather from each member is for them. And ideally, it's to guide the tool and not for gossip, so it's almost, we have to make sure that they understand the importance of the anonymity of each survey, and that they understand the confidentiality required if they're going to deliver a survey. The other one that I found that we have to be really careful about in our tribal communities is the cultural implications. And by that, I think of a close relative who, in her final project for her master's in social work, she was required to provide counseling to males. And in her cultural and tribal beliefs, it was inappropriate for a female to speak over or advise a male, especially a stranger. And so I that pops into my head when I think of surveys and collecting data, because we have to be careful about respecting those cultural implications. I had folks tell me that planning wasn't their way, that their ancestors didn't believe in putting that out there. But I beg to differ. Planning has been around and has been our means of survival as Lakota since the beginning of time. We had to plan to have food in the wintertime. We had to plan to have enough meat for a tioshpe. We had to plan where our next camping spot would be. We had to plan to be near water. All of that is planning. And so when people, I had to know how to respond if people felt that this was against a cultural belief. But it may be against a cultural belief for one family. I know in one community I worked in, it was inappropriate for a female, a daughter-in-law, to speak to her father-in-law or brother-in-laws. And that surveying would be too intimate to do that. So you create another way of gathering that information. But the other one is youth to elders. Some youth were very uncomfortable about asking elders. I think of when I was a very young Teri, and I was involved with the HIV education movement in the 80s. And it was so awkward for me to work with my elders and educate them about how to not spread HIV by using condoms. I was not going to have conversations with my elders about condoms. And so recognizing that respect that we have in our tribal communities for young people and elders. The planning ambassadors that I used to collect data for a tribe that I worked with, it was very successful because it was a seeking information from an elder mode. It wasn't a demanding information from an elder, and it wasn't telling an elder what to do. And so it worked very well. But I think all of those are very important to understand. Or even clanships. Certain clans are not to interact with other clan members, so make sure that whatever the cultural implications may be in your tribal community, that you respect those in collecting that data. I also put up some references to Mato Ohitika, which is a friend of mine's business who does data analytics. You can do SurveyMonkey and all the other online survey tools out there. But he has a PhD in data collection. He would be an awesome resource to look up. That's Joseph Robertson, Dr. Joseph Robertson out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The other thing that's come up is sharing the surveys on Facebook and the importance of getting data from a broad base. But my caution to you about using Facebook is that that's not always where you're going to get information from elders. So while Facebook may be one, or social media may be one great way and means of gathering information, I encourage you to make sure that you open and make it available to your elders in your community. I've created some questions for you to look at and consider, and I hope that I've been helpful, and I wish you all the best in your endeavors in the work that you do in your tribal communities, and thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you.